All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 63 for June 2024. Curtain up, 4 early Philadelphia playwrights: Richard Penn Smith, Robert Montgomery Bird, Robert Taylor Conrad, and George Henry Boker. Laurel Hill East is a National Historic Landmark, an arboretum, a sculpture garden, a nature preserve, and an active cemetery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's a giant outdoor people museum. It opened in 1836. It remains a popular visiting spot for tens of thousands of visitors every year. It has a sister cemetery, Laurel Hill West. It's across the Schuylkill River in Bala Cynwyd. That was founded in 1869. It has a totally different feel, totally different history, totally different population. I am Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine at Temple University in Philadelphia, volunteer tour guide at Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West, and volunteer podcaster. America, in its adolescent years, struggled to break away from English parental influence and develop its own identity, including theatrical presentations. In the early 19th century, 4 Philadelphians became the primary purveyors of American theater and playwriting, but none of them were writers as their primary profession. Richard Penn Smith was a lawyer who essentially invented the frontier character Davy Crockett before he wrote the play Caius Marcus for famed actor Edwin Forrest. Robert Montgomery Bird trained as a physician, but he became one of Forrest's go-to playwrights after Forrest made a career playing the gladiator in Bird's play of the same name. Robert Taylor Conrad was another polymath who not only wrote plays, but served as mayor of Philadelphia in 1854, the year of consolidation. And George Henry Boker, slightly younger than the other 3 by a few years. He was the ultimate Renaissance man, scholar, writer, politician, co-founder of the Union League, and the acknowledged 19th century American master of writing sonnets. Oh, and he wrote plays also. These 4 men helped advance theater in America by shifting the emphasis from English plays of manners to American plays of action heroes. They are featured in this month's episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 63 for June 2024. Curtain up, 4 early Philadelphia playwrights. Richard Penn Smith, 1799-1854. If you are my age and you grew up being babysat by television during the 1950s, you might be inclined to believe that Walt Disney invented Davy Crockett. It was Disney who plucked Crockett out of history for a 1954-55 5-part serial on its televised Disneyland series, not on the Mickey Mouse Club. It was on Disneyland. It introduced the American public to Fess Parker as the famed frontiersman, with Buddy Ebsen, later to play Jed Clampett, as his sidekick George Russell. Disney's promotion of Crockett was very successful. By the end of 1955, Americans had purchased more than $300 million of material about Davy Crockett, everything from bubblegum trading cards to personalized coonskin caps. Within 3 weeks of the show's debut, its star, the 6'6" Fess Parker, became a household name. The TV show's theme song, The Ballad of Davy Crockett, was inescapable. The biggest hit was by Bill Hayes, #1 on the weekly charts for 4 weeks, #7 for the year. But Fess Parker's recording reached #6 on the weekly charts and 31 for the year, and Tennessee Ernie Ford's version peaked at #4 on the weekly country charts and was ranked at #37 for the year. Other recordings showed up by everyone from the Sons of the Pioneers to, believe it or not, in 1968, Louis Armstrong recorded The Ballad of Davy Crockett. More than 10 million copies of that song were sold. Now, as a reminder, Davy Crockett, born in Tennessee, 1786, was not a figure of the so-called Wild West that we see on television and movies. That was a very short-lived time, just a few decades after the Civil War until the early 20th century. He was part of the wild frontier, as the song lyrics put it. Similarly, Crockett was not a contemporary of Daniel Boone, who was born in 1734, 52 years before Crockett. Now, as far as I can see, there have been more than 70 biographies of Davy Crockett. Even while he was alive, the legend of this frontiersman was building across the nation. Crockett purportedly wrote a couple of autobiographies late in life, which many people have taken as gospel, but which have muddied the waters about history. One biographer says he was uncouth, loud, illiterate, famous for his colorful mountain language. Another says, like Daniel Boone 50 years earlier, was articulate and well-read. Although he had little formal education, he was no illiterate backwoods bumpkin. Who to believe? It was a 1934 book review in Southern Review told of Davy's trip to Texas after he was voted out of office in Tennessee. He was initially a Jacksonian Whig who fell away from his leader over the second bank decision and especially the forced removal of Native Americans on the so-called Trail of Tears. With tongue-in-cheek, the unidentified reviewer describes part of Davy's adventures. Quote, his constituents, having failed to reseat him, Crockett set out with a few camp followers for Texas. From Little Rock, he swung through North Texas to Honey Grove, and after 2 months back to Nacogdoches. There, a pirate, a bee hunter, an Indian, and Thimblerig the Gambler threw in their lots with him, left him to join a band of Comanches, but rejoined him later at Bear, and fell with him at the Alamo. After his death, myth-making grew apace. He became a half-god who laughed the lightning out of countenance and carried a piece of sunrise in his pocket. End quote. What do we know? We know that Davy Crockett fell at the Alamo in San Antonio, or Bear, on the 6th of March, 1836, just a few months before this cemetery opened. Whether he was killed in battle or as a prisoner after he surrendered is still being debated, and his legend continued to grow. Boston actor Frank Mayo, I talked about him in All Bones Considered number 26, made a pretty good living acting as Davy Crockett. He started in 1872. He played that role more than 1,000 times until his death 24 years later. This play, which was written by Frank Murdoch, was one of the most popular of its day. Frank Mayo is interred in a mausoleum at Laurel Hill West. In 1836, the year of Davy Crockett's death, a volume was published by Nephus and Cornish at 278 Pearl Street in New York. The title page said, Colonel Crockett's Exploits and Adventures in Texas, wherein is contained a full account of his journey from Tennessee to the Red River and the Natchitoches, and thence across Texas to San Antonio, including his many hairbreadth escapes, etc., etc. And then it says, written by himself, implying this is an autobiography. It was published the year that he died. I guess it's possible. It is adroitly done. It is something you would not expect from a man whom many called illiterate. This is a direct quote from a man who people said was illiterate. Quote, "I have been told that there was one Shakespeare more than 200 years ago who was brought up a hostler, but finding it dull business took to writing plays, and made as great a stir in his time as I do at present. Which will go to show that 1 ounce of genuine horse sense is worth a pound of your book learning any day, and if a man is only determined to go ahead, the more kicks he received in his breech, the faster he will get on his journey." End quote. Fairly erudite for an illiterate man. You also would not expect a blow-by-blow description of the deaths of Colonel Bowie and Travis, and Crockett reading from his diary. The last entry from this journal is dated March 5th. Quote, "Pop, pop, pop, bomb, 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 throughout the day. No time for memorandums now. Go ahead. Liberty and independence forever." The chapter then concludes with the lines, "Here ends Colonel Crockett's manuscript." Go ahead was the motto that Crockett lived by, and the phrase by which he is best remembered. Now, the next chapter in this book is almost all fiction, an eyewitness account of the last battle and its aftermath. According to this narrative, Crockett was one of 6 survivors taken to Santa Ana for disposition. "Have I not told you before how to dispose of them? Why do you bring them to me?" At the same time, his brave officers plunged their swords into the bosoms of their defenseless prisoners. Colonel Crockett, seeing this act of treachery, instantly sprang like a tiger at the ruffian chief. But before he could reach him, a dozen swords were sheathed in his indomitable heart, and he fell and died without a groan, a frown on his brow, and a smile of scorn and defiance on his lips. End quote. This so-called autobiographical mishmash was obviously not written by Davy Crockett, unless he dictated it from his lost grave to a spiritualist. The author was an opportunistic Philadelphia playwright and essayist named Richard Penn Smith. But unfortunately, what Smith created out of whole cloth became the gospel about Crockett, and it was referenced by many researchers and authors. Smith's writings account for the mythology of Davy Crockett. Richard Penn Smith was born at the family home on the southeast corner of Chestnut and 5th Street. It's just across the street from what is now Independence National Park. He was the 3rd son of William Moore Smith and Anne Randolph. William owned land which eventually became Norristown, Pennsylvania. Richard's grandfather, William Smith, D.D., born in Scotland, was first provost of the College of Philadelphia, and he served in that role for 25 years. Richard could look back on a talented and refined ancestry and a cultivated home life. He was educated at a local school run by Joseph Neef at the Falls of Schuylkill, with supplementary instruction from John Sanderson. Then he was sent to John T. Carre's school in Mount Airy, and then to Huntington, Pennsylvania, which his grandfather had founded. That was under the care of the Presbyterian clergyman John Johnson. In 1818, he returned to Philadelphia and entered the law practice of William Rawle. 2 years later, he was admitted to practice as a member of the bar. He was 21 years old and was already a good classical scholar and a tolerable linguist. His first appearance as an author was in the columns of The Union, where he published a series of moral and literary works under the title of The Plagiary. Near the close of 1822, he purchased the Aurora, the newspaper that you heard about in prior episodes, from William Duane. He and the paper lasted about 5 years until he lost interest, and he resigned to resume the practice of law. His newly found leisure time as a lawyer was mostly spent studying drama. Smith's good friend, Morton McMichael, you've heard about him in numerous podcasts, wrote of him late in life. His favorite study is the drama, and with this department of literature he is thoroughly familiar. With the dramatists of all nations he has an extensive acquaintance, and in the dramatic history of England and France he is profoundly versed. Perhaps there are few who have studied the old masters in this art with more devoted attention and with a keener enjoyment of their beauties. It turns out that writing historical fiction that masquerades as autobiography was not to be Smith's specialty. He was one of several young playwrights who were starting to make a name for themselves in the world of Philadelphia dramaturgy in the early 19th century. Between 1825 and 1835, Richard Penn Smith wrote 20 plays, of which 15 were performed in theaters of Philadelphia and elsewhere. He also produced a novel, which had a wide sale, and many tales and essay-like sketches, considerable verse, and some biography and criticism. Several of his plays were written on a week's notice or less. The entire last act of the play William Penn was written on the afternoon of the day before its performance. Yet this hasty production ran 10 successive nights, drew full houses, and was afterwards revived several times. Virtually everything Smith wrote shows evidence of hasty composition. Now, in those days before radio, television, movie theaters, motorized vehicles, etc., theater was about the only entertainment for members of Philadelphia society. Fortunately, I do not have to set aside 10 or 15 minutes to explain the 19th century Philadelphia theater scene, because my friend, Peter Schmitz, who teaches theater history at Temple University, has done this job for me with his excellent podcast series, Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia. Episodes 8 through 20 cover this period. He talks at length about Edwin Forrest, who's interred at Old St. Paul's Episcopal in Old City. Fanny Kemble, the grandmother of Owen Wister, who's not interred in Philadelphia. Mrs. Louisa Lane Drew, she's buried at Mount Vernon Cemetery, across the street from Laurel Hill. He talks about many others. I highly recommend the podcast, Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia. Around 1825 seems to be the step-off point in America's dramatic history, and Smith led the way for American playwrights with his compositions of romantic tragedy. At this time, American theaters were far more likely to take a standard such as Goldsmith or Sheridan than take a chance on an unknown American playwright. In 1825, Smith wrote a farce entitled The Pelican and a melodrama entitled The Divorce, neither of which saw light of day on stage. His only long novel, The Forsaken, was also written in 1825. The year 1828 marks his first appearance as a playwright with a performance of Quite Correct at the Chestnut Street Theater. 1829 and 30 saw the production of no less than 8 plays from his pen, 7 of which were performed at one of the big 3 of Philadelphia theaters, Chestnut Street, Walnut Street, and Arch Street. The 8th was performed in Baltimore. Among those written and not performed were such intriguing titles as The Bombardment of Algiers and Shakespeare in Love. Now, competition could be stiff. On the 8th of January, 1829, Smith's play, The 8th of January, commemorating Andrew Jackson's victory over the British at New Orleans, opened at the Chestnut Street Theater. Not to be outdone, the Walnut Street Theater on the same night produced a parody entitled The Glorious 8th of January. On the 5th of May, 1823, Smith had married Eleanor Matilda Lincoln. But of the 5 children born to this union, only one lived to maturity, Horace Weems Smith. Weems, by the way, is spelled W-E-M-Y-S-S. He became biographer to his father and grandfather. Eleanor died after less than 10 years, and Horace then became Richard's constant companion. He went to evening meetings where his father's friends would sit around and talk. Robert Montgomery Bird, Joseph Clay Neal, Edwin Forrest, Edgar Allan Poe, Louis Antoine Godey, many others you've heard about on prior podcasts. He married a second time in 1836 to Isabella Stratton Knissell, K-N-I-S-E-L-L, and he retired to the family seat at the Falls of Schuylkill. 5 children were also born to this union, but all of them reached adulthood. In his Life of Edwin Forrest, James Reese calls attention to the way Richard Penn Smith was celebrated for his ready wit, sarcastic humor, and repartee. Few people are said to have had the courage to measure lances with him in a battle of wits. In other words, he kind of comes across as a smartass. There was another play, The Deformed, or Woman's Trial, that was announced at the Philadelphia Daily Chronicle as opening at the Chestnut Street Theater. Quote, "The manager, ever anxious to encourage native talent, begs leave to inform his fellow citizens that the greatest care and attention have been bestowed upon the present drama, and that no effort has been wanting to render it worthy their appropriation and support. This evening, February 4th, will be performed in an entire new drama written by R.P. Smith, Esquire, of this city, author of The Disowned, 8th of January, etc., and which has been some weeks in preparation, called The Deformed, or Woman's Trial." End quote. Smith's next play, Caius Marcus, was written under the inspiration of Edwin Forrest. He followed its development from the beginning. It was performed in 1831 in New York, with Forrest in the lead. Forrest added this to his repertoire of plays about heroes of the Roman era. Critics were unanimous in praising the literary quality of Smith's work. But Forrest later latched onto the plays The Gladiator, written by Robert Montgomery Bird, and Jack Cade by Robert Taylor Conrad, and those epics, along with Metamora by John Augustus Stone, who's buried at Mount Moriah, they became his go-to set pieces, and Caius Marcus kind of fell by the wayside. I will talk about Bird and Conrad later in the podcast. Finally, the actress of Padua enjoyed the longest popularity of any of Smith's plays. It was based on Victor Hugo's melodrama Angelo, Tyran de Padua. It opened at the American Theater in Philadelphia in 1836, but it played for many years afterward around the country, including with an appearance by Charlotte Cushman at the Lyceum in New York in 1851. Anecdotes about Smith included several from the green room. He was apparently blessed with a very thick skin. On one occasion, he entered the theater during the first run of one of his own pieces, just as the curtain was falling, and met with an old-school fellow who had that day arrived in Philadelphia after an absence of several years. The first salutation was scarcely over when the curtain fell, and the author's friend innocently remarked, "Well, this is really the most insufferable trash that I have witnessed for some time." "True," replied Smith, "but as they give me benefit tomorrow as the author, I hope to have the pleasure of seeing you here again." Another story. A friend met him in the lobby as the green curtain felt like a funeral pall on one of his progeny, and unconscious of its paternity, asked the author with a sneer, "What was that all about?" "Really," was the grave answer, "it is now some years since I wrote that piece, and though I paid the utmost attention to the performance, I confess I'm as much in the dark as you are." End quote. Contemporary theater historians now place Richard Penn Smith as a forerunner of the great 19th century Philadelphia playwrights and their works. An era of romantic tragedies that starts with Smith's Caius Marius, continues through Robert Montgomery Bird and The Gladiator or The Broker of Bogota, Jack Cade by Robert T. Conrad, and as a climax to this quartet, all of whom are interred at Laurel Hill East, Francesca da Rimini by George Henry Boker. It is really unclear about how much Smith wrote in his life and how much has actually been preserved. Several known plays are missing. Much of what he wrote on a day-to-day basis was ephemeral. One biographer says, "Mr. S. has written much for the periodical literature of the day, both political and literary, and his poetical pieces, if collected, would make a large volume. But these appear to have been scattered abroad without any purpose of reclamation. His name is attached to a limited number, which are distinguished by a healthy tone of thought, neatness of expression, and harmony of versification. But as generally they were produced for some particular occasion, they have, most of them at least, passed into oblivion with the occasions that called them into existence. When Richard Penn Smith died in 1854, he was barely mentioned in Philadelphia newspapers, although there was some national notice of his passing. He was 55 years old, interred at Laurel Hill East, Section G, with his father, grandmother, and his first wife. His second wife, Isabella, outlived him by 24 years. His son, Horace Weems Smith, named after a local actor friend of his father's, developed the reputation of a writer on his own. Horace made a list of his father's books auctioned after his death. His library was more than 1,700 volumes, plus numerous works of biography, travel, history, poetry. But by far the largest collection devoted to a single subject was that pertaining to English drama, and that contained more than 300 volumes. There were also many French plays and books relating to French drama. Just a few months after Richard's death, his 15-year-old daughter, Isabella Penn Smith, attempted to jump off a car of the Norristown Railroad, but she slipped and both legs were thrown under the wheels. She frantically managed to pull one leg back in time, but was not so fortunate on the second one. There was an eyewitness physician who applied a tourniquet, and she was taken home where the family doctor completed the amputation. Isabella recovered. She grew up to marry James Ezekiel Fleming in 1859. He was a captain during the Civil War. And other than Horace from his first marriage, Isabella was the only one of Smith's children from his second marriage to be interred at Laurel Hill East with him. Robert Montgomery Bird, 1806-1854. Several years ago, the American Film Institute published a list of the 100 best movie quotes of all time, ranging from, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," on top, to, "You gotta ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?" at number 51. To number 100, "I'm king of the world." Nowhere on that list is a line that I guarantee you will know and will garner a response. At an appropriate moment, stand and say very seriously, "I am Spartacus," and wait. About 10 or 15 seconds, someone else will slowly stand and say, "I am Spartacus." There's a 30-minute compilation on YouTube of "I am Spartacus" moments taken from film, television, and stage. My personal favorite is the Starbucks commercial, where Spartacus orders a triple latte. Spartacus is a gladiator. Literally means swordsman. It's from the Latin gladius. Think of the leaf shape of the gladiolus, which is sometimes called a sword lily. Some gladiators were volunteers, but most were enslaved men trained under harsh conditions to fight, sometimes to the death, for the entertainment of crowds. The gladiator games lasted for nearly 1,000 years, and they reached their peak about the time of Christ. During the Third Servile War, between 73 and 71 BC, Spartacus was the name of one of several gladiator leaders who planned the escape of about 70 slaves. Eventually, their number swelled to tens of thousands, and they fought their way through the Roman legions to Mount Vesuvius. But in 71 BC, they were overwhelmed. 6,000 survivors of the revolt were captured by the legions of Crassus and then crucified along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua, a distance of more than 100 miles. There was roughly one body hanging on a cross every 90 feet, the difference between home plate and first base on a ball diamond, for more than 100 miles. Gladiators and centurions are always portrayed as muscular young men, especially in the Bible. The father of progressive resistance weightlifting, Alan Calvert, recalls being attracted to the Bible as a child, not because of any inspirational scriptures, but for the engravings of these powerfully built centurions and gladiators whom he wanted to emulate. I talked about Alan Calvert in Biographical Bites from Ballon number 1 a few years ago. The character Spartacus remained a popular topic over the centuries for fiction authors and playwrights alike. Two young Philadelphia men who were drawn deeply to the Spartacus legend in the early 1800s were the actor Edwin Forrest and the physician-playwright Robert Montgomery Bird. For the complete story of Edwin Forrest, who is not buried at Laurel Hill, again, I remind you, listen to Adventures in Theater History from Season 2. I will only emphasize that Edwin Forrest was the face and the voice of theater in Philadelphia, possibly in America. He developed a repertory of plays that he used for all of his tours. He sponsored an annual writing competition to find his next big play. And in 1830, the winner was a 5-act gem called The Gladiator by local physician Robert Montgomery Bird. Forrest knew a winner when he saw it. The plot? No surprise. Spartacus is a Thracian gladiator who refuses to fight because he will not, quote, slay a man for the diversion of Romans, end quote. Thracians were an Indo-European people who occupied large parts of southeast Europe, Bulgaria, Romania, northern Greece. Phasaelus is another Thracian slave who, with other gladiators, is condemning the position of Rome and considering a revolt against the state, which has been left vulnerable by its colonizing and warmongering generals. But when Phasaelus hears that a newly captured Thracian gladiator is an even better fighter than he is, he postpones his plan for a coup. The newly captured slave is Spartacus, a man who appears to be all muscle. Spartacus agrees to battle another in order to free his captured wife and child. But when Phasaelus and Spartacus meet in the arena, they recognize each other. They're brothers. They refuse to fight. And then they incite their fellow gladiators to revolt. They yell, "Death to the Roman fiends that make their mirth out of the groans of bleeding misery. Ho, slaves, arise! It is your hour to kill. Kill, and spare not, for wrath and liberty." In the war that follows, the gladiator army, led by Spartacus, is initially successful in their crusade against the Romans. But the two brothers have differing agendas. Spartacus wants to go home. He wants to be with his wife, Sinona, and son, back in his beloved Thrace. He wants to go back to being a shepherd. That's what he had been. Phasaelus, on the other hand, has different plans. He wants to sack Rome. Phasaelus eventually defects from his brother's army when Spartacus forbids his advance on Julia, the captured niece of Crassus, a Roman praetor. Splintered, the rebelling armies are easily defeated by the Romans. Phasaelus, reconciled and reunited with his brother's dwindling campaign, attempts to escort Sinona and her son through a forest to safety. But in this attempt, Sinona and her child are slain by waiting Roman troops, while Phasaelus manages to stumble back to Spartacus and deliver the tragic news before he too dies. Enraged, Spartacus refuses a pardon granted to him by the Romans. In his final bloody fight, Spartacus manages to kill his former captor Lentulus before he is felled by multiple Roman troops over the cries of Julia's protest. When he struck the stage in death, Forrest's massive frame shook the house. Wave after wave of standing ovations were invariable following the death of Spartacus. Although it did not have a happy ending, the gladiator conveyed the huge sacrifice that man has been willing to withstand throughout history for the sake of freedom. The selfless servant dying so that others may live free. The constant ache that comes from yearning to be free. Of course, the play was written and performed in a country where the enslavement of other human beings was legal and in many ways encouraged. But this fable of escaping the bonds of slavery, the playwright had to go back 1,800 years. Robert Montgomery Bird was born in Delaware in 1806. The Birds could trace their lineage to the time of Henry VIII. His mother's maiden name was Elizabeth van Leuvenay. She was the daughter of Dutch immigrants who reached Delaware around 1700. Robert had the beginning of what was going to be a good life. But in 1810, his father died of a heart aneurysm, leaving a penniless wife and 7 children. The family dispersed and never reunited. Robert went to the home of his uncle, the Honorable Nicholas Van Dyke of Newcastle, Delaware, a man that the Marquis de Lafayette called one of the first statesmen in rank whom he knew in America. In 1815, Robert's mother married again, this time to the Reverend Samuel Barr, the man who had pronounced the vows on her first ceremony 20 years earlier. Despite losing his father while he was a toddler, Robert Byrd had what one biographer called a, quote, successful childhood, end quote. A spirited, exuberant boy who loved cricket, adventure, and a good tussle. His greatest pleasure was to steal away from home and stretch out in the garden to read and let his imagination run rampant. During Byrd's Delaware boyhood, the only school in Newcastle was Newcastle Academy. From its incorporation in 1801, John Byrd had been a trustee. The methods of instruction were described as crude and galling, and Byrd frequently came under correction by being struck on the hand or the back. The youthful Byrd swore that he would kill his tormentor when he got older, but instead he wrote him into a play. He was a villain in The Adventures of Robin Day. Quote, an illiterate, vulgar dolt, an Irishman just caught, who professed, as he said to himself, to teach nothing but reading, writing, arithmetic, and decent manners, end quote. Byrd's school education came to an end the day that his uncle discovered a sympathetic cousin tending to the young man's bruised and lacerated back. Thenceforth, it was the Newcastle Public Library, chartered in 1812, that supplied the young Byrd with his education. Family and friends called him Montgomery, or Monty. When Monty's stepfather, the Reverend Barr, died in 1818, his mother moved to Philadelphia to live with an older son, James Madison Byrd. Monty joined them in 1820. Shortly afterward, he enrolled at a school run by a Mr. Pardon Davis, apparently without any serious intellectual damage. He finally found a teacher who would spark his latent intellectual curiosity in Mr. Jimmy Cox, a professor with the knack of making his students share his enthusiasm. Montgomery soon became one of Cox's favorites, but their time together was less than a year before Monty headed back to Delaware to prepare for college, and then Philadelphia again for a year at Germantown Academy in preparation for university. There were 13 students in the upper school, 42 in the English school. Robert Montgomery Bird received his high school diploma on 12 August 1824. He was 18 years old. The profession he had chosen to pursue was medicine. Monty matriculated in the medical school of the University of Pennsylvania and at the College of Pharmacy, where he studied under Dr. Philip Singh Physic in anatomy, Dr. Robert Hare in chemistry, Dr. George McClellan in surgery. This, of course, is before McClellan founded Jefferson Medical School in 1824, and other people you've heard about on this podcast. It was apparently during his studies that Monty started to write. He kept 2 quarto-sized books dated 1826 and 1827. They were full of copious quotations and summaries from the works of some 25 Latin, English, and American writers. He summarized and reviewed many plays, many Elizabethan. He made a list of 15 subjects for short poems, and at least 2 were completed and published in the next year in the Philadelphia Monthly Magazine. On 6 April 1827, the Medical School of the University of Pennsylvania graduated a class of 131 in Musical Fund Hall at 8th and Locust. Dr. Robert Montgomery Bird's thesis was on, pulmonary tuberculosis to be exact. Dr. Byrd opened an office at 13th Street above Pine, directly across the street from the Deaf and Dumb Asylum on Broad Street. He disliked his new profession intensely. He kept no casebook, he refused to charge, he gave away drugs, and within a year he closed up shop, relinquished the practice of medicine. He never resumed it, although he did do teaching and lecturing later in life. That means he was going to try to earn a living by a life in letters. In the late 1820s. It was only now becoming possible for Americans, but the growth of a profession was hampered by inadequate copyright laws and really an apathy on the part of the American public for works with American authorship. If the reader in a bookstore had a choice between a thick volume by Sir Walter Scott or Alfred Lord Tennyson that cost 25 cents because nobody was paying the copyright fee, or the latest work from Americans, Longfellow or Poe, but they cost $1 because they were actually paying the authors, this would be a hard choice to make. At least the English authors had their home audience to depend on. They didn't get any royalties for the American sales. American authors had not yet begun to catch on in the old world. So American men of letters, who were not independently wealthy, were forced to supplementary means for livelihood. Longfellow and Lowell were teachers. Emerson was a lecturer. Hawthorne, public service. Poe, literary criticism and book reviews. Nobody made a living just by writing books or plays. But at least the author of a book of essays or of romance had at least the protection and satisfaction of the printed volume. His name was on the title page, a warrant in a way of its ownership. But the dramatist had nothing of the sort. After writing his play, he confined it in manuscript to a single actor or manager who settled for it in any way the parties agreed upon. In some cases, copies were made from stolen and mutilated versions of the copies and given by other companies without either the consent or remuneration of the author. There were no laws to define an author's or an actor's rights in a play. And once the play had been printed, it passed out of control of the author totally. The amount was usually a single payment. So whether the author presented the show more than 1,000 times or decided it was worthless after the first night, the amount paid was the same. The profits went to the actors and the managers. Plus, there was no international copyright law. And like the current literature, Americans had a preferential taste for European drama over American offerings. Now, to keep the comforts of a home, Monty shared a house at 151 South 10th Street with two of his brothers, John and Thomas, and their mother was in charge of the household. Thomas Jefferson Bird had been born in 1801, and at the time he lived with his brothers, he was commander of a packet ship that ran between Liverpool and various American ports. Monty began a course of serious self-study: English, French, Spanish literature, history and geography of South America, and more. He blocked out his career on a grand scale. In 1828, he sketched out his plan for life. He would write 55 plays along with a number of romances and collections of stories. So now it's 1818. That's the year that 22-year-old Edwin Forrest decided he needed new material. He liked native-born playwrights. He encouraged them and had a contest that was for native-born Americans only. There was a reward for anywhere from $500 to $3,000 for a play that Forrest could use. And over the next decade with his contest, he obtained 9 new plays for his repertoire. 4 of them were written by Robert Montgomery Bird: Pelopidas, The Gladiator, Orellusa, and The Broker of Bogota. While Pelopidas is generally acknowledged as his best work, it's never been performed. It was The Gladiator that grabbed and held Forrest's attention. Forrest met Monty at the office of Dr. George McClellan and made a deal: $1,000 for the rights to The Gladiator, which Forrest first performed at Park Theater in New York City in September 1831. Despite rain, which was described as the worst in 15 or 20 years, the house was crammed. A critic the next day said, "There was never a play more miserably got up, old dresses, old scenes, many of them full of absurdities, and to crown all, the performers, but 2 exceptions, were horribly imperfect." But the New York Standard said, "To us, it was a treat of no ordinary interest. We felt and enjoyed the feeling with pride and satisfaction. We feel no hesitation in putting it down as the best native tragedy extant. Any course of American theater history will spend at least an hour discussing Edwin Forrest and the Gladiator, but news about the playwright himself is scarce. No matter what the critics said, the audience loved it. Another dramatist, George H. Boker, he's coming up in the podcast also, we're going to hear about him later, said, "If Dr. Bird had managed rightly about the Gladiator, he would have died a rich man." Edwin Forrest ended up performing this role more than 1,000 times in his career. The Gladiator made it to the Arch Street Theater on October 24th. Hundreds of potential ticket buyers were turned away. The managers of the theater were Americans. All of the chief performers were Americans, and the play was written by an American. A Philadelphia critic noted, "Forrest is undoubtedly the best man for Spartacus in Christendom." Another critic, Charles Durang, said, "The entire male portion of the audience rose to its feet and gave at least 9 cheers. I never saw in my experience any theatrical applause so wildly and impulsively given, and so it went through the land." Between 1834 and 1837, Monty produced 4 full novels. Nick of the Woods, 1837. It's a bloody romance set in Kentucky. It's really considered his most successful novel. Shepherd Lee, 1836, is a novel that explores themes of upward mobility, materialism, abolitionism, spiritualism, all of the things that were central to the area. It's now regarded as a masterpiece of the early American Republic. Calabar, or The Night of the Conquest, a romance of Mexico, 1834, and The Infidel, or The Fall of Mexico, 1835, are novels known for their detailed and accurate descriptions of Mexican history. An author contemporaneous with Monty was literary critic Edgar Allen Poe, who called Calabar, quote, "beyond doubt one of the best American novels." In typical fashion, though, Poe recognized moments of genius in Bird's novels, but did not refrain from criticizing. He said that the work lacked consistently strong structure and style. Thursday morning, 13 July, 1837, Dr. Robert Montgomery Bird married Miss Mary Mayer, daughter of the Reverend Philip F. Mayer, who performed the ceremony at his own church, Old St. John's on Reese Street above 5th. Monty and his new bride now made their home at 140 North 12th Street. Mary studied portrait painting under Thomas Sully, and she became a successful portraitist. Monty took a job as editor for the American Monthly magazine for a decent salary, $500 a year plus $2 a page of the work of his own. And he may have been planning a magazine of his own, but his lifestyle was changing. He came down with something. It's hard to pin down what this is. He became more sedentary, unhygienic. He wouldn't bathe. He would only eat 2 meals a day. He took little or no exercise, wouldn't go for walks. And he fell into the habit of mostly writing at night. And then his general health approached near collapse, and at one point he went blind for a few weeks. But his sight did come back. Whatever this spell was, it passed. His son, Frederick Meyer Bird, was born on June 1838. Frederick grew up to be chaplain and professor of psychology, Christian evidence, and rhetoric at Lehigh University. He also spent time as editor of Lippincott magazine, we heard about that last month, and of Chandler's Encyclopedia. He was also known widely as a hymnologist and a numismatist. Frederick is interred in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Well, the strain of city life had become too much for Monty. He moved back to the land, a 300-acre riverside property in Maryland, which he called, of course, Bird's Nest. He became an active farmer. He would get up at 4:30 in the morning and work until 8:30 at night. He called his neighbors savages, Western-like, living in cabins without furniture, don't know the name or the use of any chattel beyond bed, chair, and table, are amazed at a bureau, petrified at a pier table, and come far and wide to be a look at your toilet. He took farming seriously. He worked on ways to improve hemp culture and to find new uses for the pea vine, sesame, nettle, ground nuts, and other crops. Monty also came up with a new way to make bricks using large racks and drying sheds with movable roofs, which made the process swifter and less laborious. But his writing had stopped. The firm Lane Blanchard had encouraged him to write a history of the United States, assuring him of its publication. But Bird quickly discovered that writing a history was not an easy task after a full day of farming. While working with Dr. George McClellan and John Frost of Central High School, both of whom I've talked about in prior podcasts, Monty tried to get a production of his favorite Peloponnesus. He was offered 10% of the gross receipts, but nothing ever came of it. In the spring of 1841, Bird turned to a profession to which he was superbly fitted, but which to him was always the most irksome of tasks, teaching. In the fall of 1839, a new medical college had been founded in Philadelphia on Filbert Street above 11th Street. It was known as Pennsylvania Medical College. It was a branch of the Pennsylvania College at Gettysburg. Warm personal friends joined him on the board of directors, Dr. William Rush, George McClellan, Samuel G. Morton, and others. Monty became professor at the Institute of Medicine and Materia Medica. He moved back to Philadelphia at 20 Montgomery Square, Race Street above 10th, and later at 28 North 8th Street. In 1842, a Delaware congressional seat opened, and Monty was recruited for the slot. In his stump speeches, he said, "I am a full-blooded Delawarean, and I can boast that 5 or 6 generations of my fathers were born upon and now molder beneath the soil. And I am a Whig, a very good one." His wife opposed the congressional nomination on all grounds. Bird withdrew late in the contest. He never ran, he never served. In January 1851, Monty consulted a lawyer friend about the legality of Forrest's possession of his dramas. Bird was going to seek $12,000 in compensation, but nothing, it seems, could be done. The lawyer that he consulted said, "It would be a difficult thing to give any correct opinion about the effect of your contract with E. Forrest, because if I understand you, you have no written contract, and your only witness, poor McClellan, is dead. You've suffered him to take copies of your tragedies. What have you in writing, or what evidence have you by letter or otherwise? If you sold him a right in your plays, what proof do you have that it was not an absolute and unlimited right? It appears to me that you have suffered him to take copies of the plays and act them. You will have a great deal of trouble to get anything out of him, no matter what he does with them, unless you can prove that the right sold to him was a mere right in him to act them and not transferable to others. The length of time he's had them tends to strengthen his claim." One of Monty's last letters was written to fellow Philadelphia playwright George Henry Boker on 31 January 1853. It concerns Boker's attempts to get the Dramatic Author American Copyright Bill passed through Congress. "I have not thought it necessary in writing you this note to say anything about my personal experience, now almost an old-world recollection of matters bearing on the question you have at heart. I do think, however, that my experience would be found to differ from yours. I do not know that this bill, if it became law, would ever be of any benefit to me. But I am very sure if there had been such a law in existence 20 years ago, I would not have abandoned dramatic writing as I did in what was the moment of success and the period of youthful vigor and enthusiasm." The spring and summer of 1853 again brought the return of ill health. In March, in July, in October, and November, Dr. Bird was at the point of a breakdown, to avert which he went west, then to Cape May, and finally to the Delaware Water Gap for a month in the late summer and early fall. From the Kittatinny House, he sent 4 editorials describing the gap and its environments that appeared in the North American in August and September. In late 1853, Dr. Bird found that he had been swindled by a friend, and the combination of overwork and the anguish of betrayal brought him to a fatal attack of brain effusion and his death in late January of 1854 while owing his good friend and sponsor, John Claypool, nearly $20,000. Dr. Robert Montgomery Bird was interred at Laurel Hill Cemetery's north section in plot 033. His stone is barely legible, and at one time it was sheared into two pieces, but it is now patched back together. Today, Bird is remembered not so much for his novels, but for the plays that he wrote for the great Edwin Forrest, especially The Gladiator, the first English-language play ever to be performed more than 1,000 times during the playwright's lifetime, and which in its way made stars out of Edwin Forrest in the 19th century, Kirk Douglas in the 20th century, and Russell Crowe in the 21st century. They all played the gladiator, Spartacus. 31 boxes of his papers are available for study at the Kislak Center of the University of Pennsylvania, including his extensive correspondence with Forrest. Bird also had a talent for music and drawing, and included in this collection are folders of musical compositions, plans for political songs, patriotic songs, operas, watercolor and pen and ink sketches that depict various theatrical scenes, landscapes, architectural designs, another polymath. And also in this collection, this 31-box collection at the Kislak, is an unpublished biography of Bird written by his wife, Mary. Oh boy, have we got a busy June for you at Laurel Hill. And you've already missed a couple of things. That's my fault, because I didn't get this podcast out on time. If you're listening right away, there is a tour for Tiny Tafts this Saturday. Tiny Tafts means children who like cemeteries, and we have the perfect person to give that tour in Guinevere. Saturday, June 8th at 1 p.m. until 2:30. There's a Hotspots tour coming up on Saturday. That's the introductory tour at Laurel Hill East, if you've never been there before. Jim Hentz is giving that one. It's Saturday from 10 until 12, the 8th. The next day, Sunday, June 9th, new tour. I'm waiting for this one. This is going to be so much fun. Jackie Mann is giving a tour called Stagecoaches and Omnibuses, Victorian Transport. I'm going to learn a lot on that. I know I am. Thursday, June 13th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., The Shade Trees of Summer at Laurel Hill West. Oh, that's going to be perfect. Adam Greenberg, our arborist, will lead that tour. And then we got something new that you're really, really, really going to like. It's called a Victorian Spirit Crawl. It's Friday, June 14th, from 7 p.m. until, let's say, 10 p.m. What we will do, there are, how many of us? 9, 10, 11, somewhere between 10 and 12 of us, and each of us will have a group of about 20 or 25 people, and we will go visit some of the more prominent people in the graveyard as we head down to a mausoleum photo booth and special drinks, and it should be a fun evening. Bring a flashlight. Bring a flashlight. The evening starts with light, but eventually we're going to run out of light. It'd be nice if you had your own flashlight. Have a lot of fun with that. This is not, unfortunately, this is not a tour for people with ambulatory dysfunction. We're going to go across a lot of open ground on this one. And the next day, if you can drag yourself out, there is a tour at Laurel Hill West by Pat Rose called Queerly Departed, LGBTQ plus stories of Laurel Hill West. That'll be at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning the 15th. That afternoon, no, not that afternoon, a couple of hours later at 11 o'clock, they're mutually exclusive. There is a tour of the Paradise neighborhood. Paradise is the little pocket of East Falls that Laurel Hill is located in. We got a movie coming up on Friday the 21st, Cinema in the Cemetery. It's called Midsummer. What is Midsummer? I don't know this movie. Midsummer, daylight illuminates the horrors that unfold at a cult festival in Sweden. 7 p.m. pop-up market featuring local artists, vendors, spiritual goods, tarot readings. 8 p.m., trivia inspired by Midsummer, hosted by the Philadelphia Film Society. 8:30 p.m., film screening, and there will be food trucks and beverages. Wow, that's going to be crowded. We can cram about 1,200 people on the hillside in South when we show these movies. Should be a lot of fun. It really should be. And we usually get access to the parking lot of the Dell. So parking is not an issue. You park at the Dell and then you come in that south entrance. Then you got to walk a little bit. You got to walk about 5 minutes to get to where the screening will be. But those movies in the cemetery are fun. Oh, and do something about the bugs. Bring bug spray. There is another Nurture with Nature tour on Saturday, June 22nd, from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. That will be at Laurel Hill West Nature Sanctuary, the Green Burial Grounds. A fun tour is Sunday, June 23rd. Patty Stringer and Tom Stringer do that. It's called Unlisted, Laurel Hill's Most Mysterious Graves. And then there's another Hotspots on Friday, June 28th from 10 a.m. until noon. That will be at Laurel Hill East, and that is Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen hadn't done many tours lately. She's a good tour guide. Should be a lot of fun. Oh my, a Shared Spaces and Storied Places tour on June 29th at 10 a.m. Sarah Hamill is the guide on that. So you're guaranteed a good tour on that also. And then finally, are you ready for it? June 30th, Gettysburg and Beyond, the Ultimate Civil War Tour. It's Russ Dodge and Andy Waskey. And I promise you, if you just loosed these two guys in the cemetery and you told them to give a tour of people who were affiliated with Gettysburg, Andy did this once, and it went for 8 hours. He was out on the grounds for 8 hours showing people various Gettysburg connections. It will not be 8 hours this time, though, but it will be a phenomenal tour. We've got the Union commander. We've got General Meade. We've got the division commander, Crawford. We've got Confederates. We've got a Confederate general there. He wasn't at Gettysburg. He was at Vicksburg. He was being stomped at Vicksburg. The same time that they were being stomped at Gettysburg. Anyway, lots of good information on that. That's a fun tour. Again, the Ultimate Gettysburg Tour, Sunday, June 30th at 10 a.m. I'm not going to tell you about July. That's enough. That told you a lot about June. Let's get back to the podcast. Robert T. Conrad, 1810-1858. I want to make an acknowledgement before I start this. Andrew Heath is a lecturer in American history at the University of Sheffield, UK. He is currently writing a book, or he was at the time that he published this in 2013. He was writing a book on the consolidation of 1854. Anyway, much of this information is copyright 2013 Rutgers University, at least in the first few minutes of the podcast. Although Philadelphia as a city has been around since William Penn founded it in 1682, it took the Consolidation Act of 1854 to extend its territory from Penn's 2-square-mile green country town to nearly 130 square miles. This mid-century legislation made the municipal borders coterminous with Philadelphia County and turned the metropolis into the largest in the nation, a position it held until Chicago leapt ahead in 1889. Consolidation's supporters believed it would better allow municipal authorities to deal with the epidemics of riot and disease that had ravaged the city in the 1830s and the 1840s. Although the bid to overtake New York as the first city failed, the 1854 Act led to some impressive civic achievements, and since its passage, the city boundaries have barely changed, despite charter revisions in 1887 and 1951. Until 1854, Philadelphia's population concentrated within the original city boundaries set by Penn between the Delaware and the Schuylkill River, and from Cedar, what is now South Street, to Vine. It was about 12,000 acres. By 1820, however, inhabitants in the independent boroughs, districts, and townships that made up the rest of the county outnumbered those in the city proper. Some of these suburbs were significant in their own right. Spring Garden, the Northern Liberties, and Kensington, all north of the city center, ranked as the 9th, 11th, and 12th biggest urban settlements in the nation in the 1850 census. And while they varied in their social and political character, they tended to be poorer and more democratic than the historic center, which they sometimes referred to as the Whig Gibraltar. The first organized calls to unite the built-up portions of the county under one municipal authority came in response to two major riots in 1844. The anti-Catholic violence by the newly established Know Nothing political party, which broke out in the northern suburb of Kensington, and the southern district of Southwark, exposed the inadequacy of the existing system of law enforcement. There were no uniformed officers in the county. Every jurisdiction was responsible for its own policing, and there was very little to prevent violence from escalating. It took state militia armed with cannon to suppress the Southwark disturbance. I will do a full podcast on the nativist or the Know Nothing riots sometime in the next year, and we'll come back to them again in a few minutes. Well, soon after these riots, the public ledger called for the annexation of built-up outlying districts, and in November, citizens gathered at the county courthouse. County courthouse, of course, is what we now call Independence Hall. They made a case for enlarging the city boundaries, and it failed. But there was another major riot in 1849. This renewed calls for annexation and consolidation. This time the proposal enjoyed more support from the city's merchants, manufacturers, and professionals, but it failed in the state capital. Fortunately, there were no major riots from 1850 to the 1854 passage of the Consolidation Act. Many saw the system of districts as unnecessarily costly, as dozens of jurisdictions duplicated services that could have been provided more efficiently by a single government. Others feared that the city proper might become, quote, an appendage to her own colonies, end quote, as growth in industrial districts like Spring Garden and Kensington outpaced the historic center. Some no longer saw those suburbs as a financial burden, but rather as a potential source of tax revenue, because heavy investment in the Pennsylvania Railroad after its chartering in 1846 had left the city proper far more heavily indebted than its neighbors. Real estate owners in central Philadelphia complained that suburban property holders benefited from the trade that resulted from the rail link to Pittsburgh, but it contributed little in the way of public funds to the railroad's construction. Perhaps most importantly, though, supporters of consolidation believed that only a united Philadelphia would have the power and the status to overtake New York in the struggle for metropolitan supremacy, a race where the city had languished for at least 3 decades after the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 and after Chestnut Street's decline as a financial center after the attack on the Second Bank of the United States by Andrew Jackson. That's what enabled Manhattan to pull ahead as a financial center. As North and South clashed over the question of slavery extension, advocates of annexation for Philadelphia adopted their rallying cry, "In union there is strength." They used it for their own cause. In the early 1850s, both dominant political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, promised to back annexation. But in Harrisburg, proposals for charter revision went nowhere. To break the impasse, supporters of the measure decided in 1853 to nominate their own slate of candidates for the Pennsylvania Assembly and Senate. In alliance with advocates of a professional fire department, they put together a mixture of independents and regular Whigs and Democratic Party nominees. At the head of the ticket was Eli Kirk Price. He's 1797 to 1884. He's buried at Woodlands. He was a progressive real estate attorney. while the wealthy locomotive builder Matthias W. Baldwin, who's buried at Laurel Hill East, was among the candidates for the lower house. Most of the consolidation slate triumphed, and before Price went off to take his seat in the Senate, an executive consolidation committee met in Philadelphia to draft a bill. They convened in the Board of Trade Rooms at the Merchants Exchange at 3rd and Walnut, sometime in the winter of 1853-54. Many of these citizens owned substantial real estate beyond the historic corporate boundaries, and by proposing to annex the entire county rather than just the much smaller built-up environs of the city proper, they went much further than their predecessors. And despite murmurs of protest from rural districts, the charter passed both houses and was signed into law in February. The new metropolis of Philadelphia encompassed industrial suburbs, romantic rural retreats, and vast stretches of farmland. It came into being 4 months later. The Consolidation Act resulted in other important changes for newly expanded Philadelphia. Among them, the legislation gave municipal authorities the duty to preserve open spaces, and before and after the Civil War, steps were taken toward creating Fairmount Park. Fairmount Park lies entirely beyond the boundaries of the old city proper. Standardized street names and numbers followed in 1857, a professionalized fire department in 1871, and, of course, the crown jewel, the new City Hall at Broad and Market Streets, was built between 1871 and 1901. As transportation improved, more people were able to live further from their places of work without violating Marchetti's Constant. Marchetti's Constant states that the average time spent by a person for commuting each day is approximately 1 hour or 1/2 hour per a one-way trip. In the 3-mile-per-hour world of feet and horses, the compact 2 square miles of Philadelphia was perfect. And as the speed and efficiency of transportation improved, the distance between work and home could comfortably expand and still keep within that 30-minute travel time that makes people comfortable. Meanwhile, in place of the old boundaries on the county map, 24 wards sent representatives to the common and select councils. Executive power was invested in a mayor elected at large for a 2-year term for the first time. Mayoral terms had previously been only 1 year. In June, voters chose the Know-Nothing candidate, who was also the Whig candidate, playwright Robert T. Conrad, age 44. He was the first mayor to hold office in the expanded city. Robert Taylor Conrad was born to John Jacob Conrad, 1770 to 1815, a publisher, and Maria Elizabeth Reifschneider Conrad, 1772 to 1842. He was educated for the bar. He attained a high reputation as a political speaker and as an editor and as a poet. Before he was 21 years old, he wrote a tragedy, Conradin. And in 1832, he published the Daily Commercial Intelligencer, which was merged into the Philadelphia Gazette. But because of health issues, he returned to the law in 1834, and he became a court recorder. But he kept writing. In 1835, Conrad wrote one of his best-known dramas, Aylmere. It's also known as Jack Cade. It's based on a popular revolt in 1450 against the government of England. Edwin Forrest immediately claimed this play as his own. He performed it hundreds of times in his career. Much like other Forrest plays, this would involve the little man successfully taking on the system, fighting for freedom. Forrest's performances of Jack Cade represented more than 1/4 of his total appearances on Philadelphia stages from 1841 to 1855. Forrest performed 263 times. 69 of the performances were Jack Cade. In fact, his performances of Jack Cade surpassed the combined total of his other favorites, Metamora and the Gladiator, during that period. Metamora was only performed 30 times and the Gladiator 36 times. In 1838, Conrad was selected judge of the criminal sessions for the city and county of Philadelphia. And when that court was dissolved, he resumed the pen and became an editor for Graham's magazine. Then he was associate editor of the North American, where he worked with many people I've talked about on this podcast in past episodes. In the June 1844 edition of Graham's magazine, there is a 3-page biography appreciation of Conrad that starts on page 21 by one of his fellow editors, Edgar A. Poe. Quote, Robert T. Conrad has acquired not only a local rather than a very general reputation, but also credit less for actual performances than for ability to perform. To the literary world, he is known principally as the author of Aylmere, but by an exceedingly numerous class of personal friends, he is recognized as the author of a multitude of good things, both in prose and verse, and varying in character, if not precisely from grave to gay, at least from the most pointed and pungent to the most philosophical and austere. His compositions, with rare exception, have been the unconsidered trifles of the hour, intended only to serve the purpose of the moment, but in all is evinced the capacity for noble achievement. And in Philadelphia, where he's best known and therefore best appreciated, it's always been a matter for regret that events have not thrown him more unreservedly into the arena of literary exertion. While yet a boy, he had become noted as a contributor to many literary and especially to many political journals. A certain terseness and vigor of thought and a rare polish of style had drawn upon him the attention of the many and made his future career a subject of speculation for the few. Thus assured, he engaged temporarily in the management of several weekly papers, and in 1832 he commenced on his own account the publication of the Daily Commercial Intelligencer, devoted to the Whig cause, and the leading articles may be safely referred to as the most forcible of their epoch. Poe then tells of Conrad's time spent in the legal profession, but he keeps coming back to Conrad's writing. Quote, his purely literary labors spread over a wide field. He has written much, although cursorily, for the magazines and reviews. Our readers do not need to be told that we regard the author of Sonnets on the Lord's Prayer and Death of the Deliverer and The Sons of the Wilderness as a poet of no ordinary power. These pieces are remarkable for all the qualities which distinguish the writer's prose, for terseness and vigor of thought and expression, correct and novel imagery, and a certain concise epigrammatism. Their pathos is frequently exquisite. Poe also gave his impression of the play Aylmere. The poet has constructed a most admirable drama. The incidents are arranged with a great skill and with much apparent knowledge of stage technicalities, a very important item in playwriting. The action never flags, and therefore never the interest. The strength of the author seems laid out upon the two characters of Aylmere and his Italian wife Violante, and both are very effective. The fierce, bold, vengeful, yet noble nature of the hero is drawn with exceeding force and truth. And when we regard it as drawn for the peculiar acting of Mr. Forrest, we cannot help regarding it altogether as a masterpiece. Such a flattering, mostly positive narrative sounds like it came out of Poe on one of his more generous days. For one reason or another, Conrad was 34 years old when Poe wrote his effusive evaluation of his work. Conrad was drawn heavily into the Whig Party, but after 1850, the two-party system which pitted the Whigs against the Democrats was collapsing under the weight of the politics of slavery. And then there was the immigration problem. The Know-Nothings, also known formally as the American Party, was neither for nor against slavery, Although individual members certainly had their own opinions, they felt the slavery dilemma could be resolved by first ensuring the purity of elections from foreign influence. 1850. Let me read that again. The problem could be resolved by first ensuring the purity of elections from foreign influence. Okay. The Know-Nothings were more concerned about what seemed to be a frightening number of Roman Catholics entering the country. The American Party, which is the other name they went under, avoided any designated religion. In fact, they preferred the term supreme being over God, and they tempered their visceral hatred of Catholics by instead referring to Romanism or popery. Ironically, the American Party slowly shifted the goals of the nativist movement. It went from pursuing an exclusive anti-Catholic state to ensuring an American state radically removed from any church influences. In other words, the call for strict continued separation of church and state in the 1850s did not come from any specific religious belief, but rather from a non-religious political party. Conrad got pulled into the mayoral race of 1854 after the Democrats nominated Richard Vaux, who would later become the first political boss of Philadelphia. The Whig Party nominated Conrad as their candidate. It is unclear if the Whig Party knew at the time that Conrad had joined the American Party. He had become a know-nothing. Conrad promised if he won, though, that he would appoint only native-born Americans to office. In particular, he was talking about the police department. There were a lot of Irish immigrant police that were bothering people, shall we say. He vowed to reduce the city's rapidly increasing crime rate, which most native-born Americans blamed on immigrants. He promised to close saloons on Sunday, as devout Protestants blamed immigrant drinkers for disturbing their quiet observance of the Sabbath. Conrad also denounced the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It was in 1854's off-year elections that the Know-Nothing Party had its greatest showing in the United States. In just 1 year, the Know-Nothing membership nationwide, which had been estimated at about 50,000, exploded into more than 1 million members in 1,000 lodges across the country and territories. In Philadelphia, the recent consolidation had absorbed the Democratic suburbs, and the party thought that Vaux could easily beat Conrad. The poet and author fooled everyone. He outpolled Vaux by a nearly 3-2 margin, 29,500 to 21,000, and he assumed office. He was now the know-nothing mayor of Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia's results were not isolated. By the spring of 1855, Know-Nothings controlled the state governments of Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, where every seat in the state Senate and all but 3 of the 378 positions in the lower house went to Know-Nothings. In the 1856 presidential election, the American Party's presidential candidate was former President Millard Fillmore. He gained 22% of the popular vote nationally. This is the second largest third-party tally by percentage in American history, just after Teddy Roosevelt's unsuccessful 1912 bid for re-election to the presidency on the Bull Moose Party ticket that garnered more than 27% of the popular vote. The most votes gathered by a third-party candidate was Ross Perot. Now, this was despite Fillmore's refusal to campaign on an anti-Catholic platform. That was the primary reason for the political party's existence. It was the slavery issue that led to the Know-Nothing Party's collapse. Anti-slavery members had defected to the new Republican Party by 1858, and by 1860, Know-Nothings were essentially gone. They were not a political force in the national level. Their 15-year existence had completely altered the political landscape of America. Conrad's 2 years, and you've heard the expression, history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. Here we have a good example of rhyming history. It's the immigrants' fault. Conrad's 2 years as mayor were quite successful. They gave Philadelphia the leadership it needed to bring the city together as a whole. I don't find very much about Conrad after he left office. I know he went back to presiding on the bench. He stayed active in politics, but he managed to stay out of the newspapers pretty well. He did marry a woman named Arabella, and they had a daughter whom they also named Arabella. And when he died suddenly, in June of 1858, at age 48, there was barely a mention in the newspapers. He and his wife and daughter are interred in the south section of Laurel Hill East in Section 14, which was purchased for him by the city of Philadelphia. There's a beautiful brownstone monument, which was purchased by a committee of his friends that formed the Conrad Monument Fund. The plot? Visit the plot. It has one of the most stunning views of the Schuylkill River and downriver to the city that you will find in the cemetery. The plain brown column is topped with a large vase. It sits on a plinth that has a simple marble shield at the base, which contains his name and his dates on Earth. He is scarcely remembered today, and because of where he's located, he is seldom visited in the cemetery. I've got to admit, I've never been on a tour that talked about him. George Henry Boker, 1823-1890. I am writing this on June 3rd. It's a Monday. The June podcast was supposed to be out on the 1st, Saturday. I got trapped in biographer syndrome. I broke the spell. I told myself, stop researching, start writing. The problem is the subject, George Henry Boker. I would put him in the same box as Morton McMichael, as being this multi-talented, good at everything, everywhere, at all the time. This Forrest Gump type character in Philadelphia's 19th century. After I sifted through what poems I might want to read, I really didn't have any energy left to write an entire script. So what I've done, I'd mapped out a 3-page outline of George Henry Boker's life and career, and then I went back and I filled in the blanks and started filling in the marginalia, and eventually, about, I'm going to say an hour ago, the rational part of my brain said, enough. So I'm not reading you a script. I'm reading my notes, and I'm reading some stuff from some 19th century magazines. If it seems a little oddly disjointed, that is why. So we got George Henry Boker. We're going to start off with his time before he was 20. 1823, George Henry Boker, born October 6th in Philadelphia to Charles Stewart Boker and Lydia A. Stewart Boker. From 1830 to 1838, from the time he was 7 until 15, he attended private schools, including Edge Hill School, where he formed a friendship with the school's owner, John Seeley Hart, who was only 13 years older than him. John Seeley Hart was 1810, 1877. He's buried at Woodlands. In 1838, his father was named manager of Girard Bank. This is 2 years after the Second Bank of the United States lost its charter. Girard Bank, which was founded in 1831, had no connection at all to Stephen Girard. I was surprised when I saw that. 1842, graduates from Princeton during the Princeton presidency of James Carnahan. He's 19 years old, but he sticks around because he has started a monthly publication at Princeton. It's called the Nassau Monthly. He is the publisher. He publishes a piece called Preeminence of the Man of Letters, and it's probably his first published piece, as we can see, when he was 19 years old. So now we're going from the time when he's 20 to 30. That means from 1943, 1843 to 1850. 1844, he marries Julia Riggs. She is the daughter of merchant Romulus Riggs. Romulus Riggs, 1782 to 1846, is buried at Laurel Hill East in Section L, 174 to 177. He was co-founder of the Farmers and Mechanics National Bank in 1814. I did a little research on him a couple of years ago. There wasn't really enough to do a podcast, but now I'm circling back and picking up what happened to his daughter. In 1845, their first child was born, George. He was the only child who survived to adulthood. 1848, he published his first book of poems, The Lesson of Life and Other Poems, and his first play, Kalenos. I will tell you more about Kalenos shortly, what it actually is staged. Between 1848 and 1857, this 9-year span, starting when he was 25 years old, he wrote and he staged 9 different plays. Moving to 1849, January 19th, he starts correspondence with Bayard Taylor. Bayard Taylor was an author who lived from 1825 to 1878. He's buried in Kennett Square. That's where he lived. Taylor is now being touted as having written the first American gay novel, Joseph and His Friends, A Story of Pennsylvania. Civil rights leader Bayard Rustin, who was born in Chester, Pennsylvania, just a few miles from Taylor's home in Kennett Square, was named for him, purportedly. I find it an odd coincidence, a weird serendipity, that a gay black man, Bayard Rustin, would be given the name of an American author who wrote the first gay novel many years before he was born. Just one of those weird little coincidences. Okay, Boker starts working on Anne Boleyn, a tragedy. May 10th, Kalenos is produced without Boker's knowledge at Sadler's Well Theatre in London. I talked to you before about the copyright problems back and forth across the ocean. Sadler's Well, I've always been curious about that name. It was founded in 1683 by a man named Sadler. People think his first name was probably Thomas. And he started a theater there. And soon he found a well on his property, and a doctor declared that the well brought the most beautiful water up, the healthful water. So he started promoting his theater as a spa, and pretty soon he had 200 or 300 people every night going to his theater to drink the health water and listen to whatever he was putting on stage. In 1850, he published Anne Boleyn, and he also wrote The Betrothal, a tragedy, which opened that year in Philadelphia. It opened on September 25th. When it played in London 3 years later, Boker wrote to another friend on October 9th. He said, quote, "I have read the Times notice of The Betrothal. It is honey to most of the other newspaper criticisms. So far as I can gather the facts from private letters, the play, to begin with, was very badly played. The English playwrights had raised the hue and cry against it. Hamstring him, slay him, cut him down, was the universal cry of my brother dramatists. Notwithstanding, and taking the accounts of my enemies for authority, the play was unusually successful with the audience on that most trying occasion, the first night. This only added to the gall of my brother dramatists and increased their exhibition of it in the newspapers, so that after 2 nights of success with the audience, the manager was so terrified by the howl of the press and by the furious personal applications, he withdrew the play to save himself. I believe I have stated the strict truth, ergo the play still stands a monument of English injustice. Mark you, it was not prejudice that caused the catastrophe. It was fear lest I should get a footing on their stage, of which Kalenos had given them timely warning." Here's one of those page flips I was talking about. Okay. April 21st, The World a Mask opens in Philadelphia. In May, he suffers the first attack of a painful eye ailment that recurs throughout his life. Historical diagnosis is always hard. Yes, I am a retired physician, and I play the fun game of historical diagnosis when something doesn't make sense. This actually makes sense. It sounds like he had either a recurrent corneal ulcer or recurrent uveitis, which is an inflammation of the entire tract, optic tract. Now we know, and I will tell you soon, about many extramarital affairs that he had. It makes me wonder whether this corneal ulcer or uveitis might not have been an untreated or poorly treated gonococcal infection, or possibly even chlamydia. Now, by December 12th, he completes The Podesta's Daughter and Other Poems. In December, we've got the first record of an extramarital affair. He's 7 years into his marriage. Is this the 7-year itch that we hear about? In 1852, by September 1st, he completes The Widow's Marriage, a comedy in blank verse. October, he has another affair. By November 14th, he completes Leonor de Guzman. Let's move up to age 30 to 40, 1853 to 1863. In 1853, that's when he wrote Robert Montgomery Bird concerning the need for dramatic author's bill, and he began to secure its passage. He is the man who essentially wrote that bill and got it through Congress so that playwrights could be paid fairly. March 1st through the 21st, 3-week period, he writes Francesca da Rimini, a tragedy. This is considered his masterpiece. Here is the prologue. Look not, grave critic, for perfection here. No gods or goddesses shall move your ear. My little stage mere men and women fill, all have some good to love, to hate some ill. 100 springs of action move each mind, and in their mien the character you'll find. Interests and feelings, base and good, have they. Some draw towards heaven, and some the other way. Arcadian virtue and Arcadian crime in abstract form may crowd the epic climb. But 'tis the drama's task the world to show, where bad and good alternate gloom or glow, where in each mind are various passions fixed, virtue with vice and vice with virtue mixed. Some lean to virtue, some to vice give way, but neither bent has undivided sway. Our plot turns on the loathing which they feel, who draw their spotless race from proud Castile, from those whose lineage bears the faintest stain of the hot blood which fires the Moorish vein. No time can reconcile, no deed abate, for that one taint the haughty Spaniards hate. As the sound man the loathsome leper shuns, so pass Castilians by Granada's sons. This is the key which gives our plot to view. Turn o'er the leaf, the way is clear. Adieu. That's a great prologue. I really like that. This is from an article about Bowker by Arthur Hobson Quinn. It says, before Leonor de Guzman had been put on the stage, Bowker had started his masterpiece. In a letter to Stoddard on March 3, 1853, he tells of his method of work. He wrote Francesca da Rimini, a play of 2,800 lines, in 3 weeks. It was composed literally at white heat. He thought about the work all day and smoked a great deal after he began composing at 9 o'clock in the evening. At 4 o'clock in the morning, he would retire for about 5 hours sleep. He came to his writing with the plan perfectly matured, so that the rapid composition was only the fruition of a long period of preparation. Same year, he writes The Bankrupt. And October 3rd, Leonor de Guzman opens in Philadelphia. 1855, he begins Königsmarck. September 26th, Francesca da Rimini opens in New York City, and then opens October 10th in Philadelphia, featuring Mrs. John Drew as Francesca. That's at the Walnut. The main theme of the tragedy is the dislike of the Spaniards for Moorish blood. This is from a review. Kalanos is a wealthy nobleman who lives at a distance from his capital and is summoned by the king to Seville. His wife, Doña Alda, wishes to go with him, but he does not allow her to do so. So her maid Martina tries to make her more discontented than she is, and Calenos is warned by Oliver, his secretary, and by Friar Gill not to go to Seville, as they feel that wrong will come of it. In Act 2, which takes place in Seville, Don Louis, a spendthrift, is introduced, and Calenos, who is his friend, helps him to pay his creditors, believing him to be an honorable man. Oliver tries to trip up Don Louis and his creditors, but does not succeed. Calenos brings Don Louis to his castle in Act 3, and he falls in love with Doña Alda and attempts to seduce her. Martina and Soto, Don Louis' servant, strike up a flirtation also. Don Louis hears of Calenos' Moorish taint and uses it to try to persuade Alda to leave him. Don Louis persuades her to meet him in the grand hall of the palace at 2 o'clock, and she is so overcome at the thought of her husband having Moorish blood in him that she swoons, and he carries her off. In the last act, Doña Alda returns after some months to die at the castle. Calenos goes to Seville and challenges Louis and kills him in a duel, Calenos being wounded to death in the duel, and Oliver coming in time to see him die. Bravo. Great drama. Great drama. Oh, December 3rd, The Bankrupt opens in New York City. 1856, Plays and Poems is published. February, there is a record of an affair with a married woman, perhaps Angie King Hicks. On August 3rd, the Dramatic Authors Bill passes Congress. Playwrights can now get paid. 1857, he completes the manuscript of Königsmarck, The Legend of the Hounds and Other Poems. He begins writing sonnets, which will become Sonnets, a Sequence on Profane Love. And in the last week of December, his mother dies. 6 weeks later, on February 8th, 1858, his father dies. And the lawsuit with Gerard Bank begins. In 1859-1860, he writes Book of the Dead. 1861, July, he meets President Lincoln. September 7th, he writes Upon the Hill Before Centerville. This is the first of his war poems. He writes these for the next 3 years. I've read a lot of these war poems. The one that sticks with me is called Dirge for a Soldier. He wrote it for his friend General Philip Kearny, who was killed on the 1st of September, 1862. He's buried at Arlington. Close his eyes, his work is done. What to him is friend or foeman? Rise of moon or set of sun, hand of man or kiss of woman? Lay 'em low, in the clover or the snow. What cares he? He cannot know. Lay 'em low. As man may, he fought his fight, proved his truth by his endeavor. Let him sleep in solemn night, sleep forever and forever. Lay 'em low, in the clover or the snow. What cares he? He cannot know. Lay him low. Fold him in his country's stars. Roll the drum and fire the volley. What to him are all our wars? What but death be mocking folly? Lay him low in the clover or the snow. What cares he? He cannot know. Lay him low. Leave him to God's watching eye. Trust him to the hand that made him. Mortal love weeps idly by. God alone has power to aid him. Lay him low in the clover or the snow. What cares he? He cannot know. Lay him low. In 1862, in November, with Judge John Hare, he founds the Union League of Philadelphia, and he serves as its secretary from 1863 to 1871. Age 40 to 50, from 1863 to 1873. 1864, he writes The Will of the People, a pamphlet arguing for Lincoln's re-election. He publishes his Poems of the War. 1865, the war ends, and for the celebration at the Union League, On July 4th, Boker wrote a poem. It's called Hymn for the Union League. Thank God the bloody days are past. Our patient hopes are crowned at last, and sounds of bugle, drum, and fife but lead our heroes home from strife. Thank God their beams o'er land and sea our blazing star of victory. And everywhere from main to main the old flag flies and rules again. Thank God, O dark and trodden race, your Lord no longer veils his face, but through the clouds and woes of fight shines on your souls a better light. Thank God we see on every hand breast high the ripening grain crops stand. The orchards bend, the herds increase, but oh, thank God for peace. In 1869, he published Königsmarck, The Legend of the Hounds, and Other Poems. Here's Sonnet 308. Love sat at ease upon Time's bony knee, pulled his gray beard, paddled his fingertips among his wrinkles, smote his bloodless lips, with rosy palms forbade his eyes to see, or turned his fatal hourglass, wantonly pulled his scythe edge against the dart which rips the heart of the adamant, cast jibes and quips straight into his teeth, out-mocking mockery. What said the phantom? Naught. He only smiled to be thus toyed with, held his wasting breath, lest he might do some damage to the child. Till love, grown weary of that pastime, saith, This is too tame. My heart with joy is wild. Come, Father, come. Let us go play with death. In 1870, he was elected president of the Philadelphia Club. And from 1871 to 1875, here's one out of left field, he was our minister to Turkey. He went into the Foreign Service. He did write his last of the sonnets to Angie King Hicks on December 30th of 1871. This was another lover that he had taken. This is, in his late 40s. In his late 40s. Moving on to age 50 through 60, in 1873, the year he turned 50, the lawsuit with Gerard Bank was settled. He no longer had to worry about that over his head from his father's work there. And in 1875, he is envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to Russia. In 1877, from June 23rd to July 9th, he wrote 14 sonnets that are all about another brief affair that he had in Paris. 54 years old. 1878, he left the diplomatic service and returned to the United States. The next year, he was elected president of the Union League, and he held that for 5 years. In 1880, he received the gold medal of the Union League. And from 1881 to 1887, he was still writing 18 more sonnets. They form the third group of the sequence on profane love. This is the last record of a love affair. 1882, September 14th, Lawrence Barrett, playing the role of Lanciato, revives Francesca de Rimini in New York to great acclaim. And in the same year, Boker is elected to the Authors Club and publishes Book of the Dead. His last few years were relatively quiet. In 1884, he was elected to the American Philosophical Society. In 1885, he wrote Nydia. In 1885-86, he wrote Glaucus. And in 1886, he began work on an edition of his complete works. But he was sick. And by 1889, he was confined to bed. He died on January 2nd, 1890. He is interred Laurel Hill East, Section A, Lot 91. I'm going to finish by reading the review of a biography in a 1928 book review in the Sewanee Review. It's called A Neglected American, George Henry Boker, Poet and Patriot. It's by Edward Scully Bradley, Philadelphia University of Pennsylvania Press. With the publication of this first biography of George Henry Boker, the literature of our lean and adolescent years is enriched by virtually the first appearance of a poet who is worthy to rank in many respects with our best. This is Boker's real initiation into that category. Known and respected by a small group of his contemporaries, both for his character and for his work, he was nevertheless so harassed and thwarted during his life that much of his best poetry still remains in manuscript. Only one of his plays has been revived in worthy manner. Remember, this was in 1928. It's almost 100 years ago. And we are forced to conclude from evidence here presented that only a small fraction of his power was realized in the unfulfilled literary career he was permitted to lead. The recovery of an appreciation of his genuine distinction we are in Dr. Bradley's debt, but there is a note of regret also in that realization. For we must conclude that the same factors which unquestionably stunted Hawthorne, leveled Longfellow in many respects to mediocrity, and tied Henry James into intellectual knots, have claimed in Boker a real victim. His powers were keyed to a note which could not survive the dissonances of his time. It would be a mistake to ascribe the limiting forces exclusively to his native city, but it is significant that Boker's three Philadelphia contemporaries and warm friends, Reed, Leland, and Taylor. Remember, Boker is a few years after the three that I told you about. All of them lived much and gained recognition abroad. Philadelphia in those years was predominantly commercial, but in this she was merely leading the country toward the Civil War in the same way that she had taken the initiative earlier in political rebellion. America as a whole, and Philadelphia in particular, were poor schools for the muses in the years of national adolescence. Boker's mistake lay in spending too much of his time at home. He should have sought backgrounds of more traditional culture in his formative years, as did Irving. But he would have been less American in doing so. Instead, he threw his energies into the social and political life of his city, cleared his father's name from the stigma of financial dishonesty, used his poetical gift for Civil War broadsides, and took his pleasure in the best that Philadelphia society offered. My note to that is, yes, he had several affairs. Like Hawthorne and others, he once tried the escape of a European diplomatic mission. His lack of satisfaction is explained in a letter to his friend Bayard Taylor in 1878. When I am at any one thing, I am absorbed in it to the exclusion of all other objects. In this statement lies the key to his successes as well as to his failures. The romantic tragedy of Francesca da Rimini was Boker's single public triumph, and even that was darkened by the postponement of its greatest production until it was too late to do him any good. He was a struggling and passionate young poet when the play was written. He was a disappointed man of the world when it was first adequately recognized. Its subject and form are both characteristic of the time. When American literature first awoke from the practical materialism of Franklin and Jefferson, it followed the path of Scott and Byron into extravagances only equaled by some of the products of decadent German Romanticism. But Francesca, by its sustained emotion and dramatic unity, justifies both matter and form. Written in 19 days, it is one of the finest examples of English literature of dramatic intensity sustained at maximum pitch. Passages in it are masterfully extravagant as poetry, and the play as a whole occupies a similar position with respect to drama of this type. Dr. Bradley supplies sufficient critical evidence to rank it as the best of the many dramatic versions of the Francesca story in all languages. This fact had, however, been tentatively recognized before the appearance of Dr. Bradley's book. His more significant discoveries are therefore the manuscripts of a pack of European travel letters addressed to Boker by the gypsy-like Charles Godfrey Leland, and of a manuscript sonnet sequence by Boker himself covering the years of his maturity, probably autobiographical in nature, and therefore representing the most personal expression of his stifled and intense emotional life. The former, of which many are printed here for the first time, form a charming and amusing interlude in the volume. For the latter, we must take Dr. Bradley's word they rank their author first among American sonneteers, with the possible exception of Longfellow. The two quoted as somewhat random examples support his claims for them. They show perfection and dignity of form, intensity of passion, a faithfulness to Renaissance models, and only an occasional lack of distinction in phrasing. Hints of their excellences and of their biographical and literary significance merely serve here to demand fuller study and presentation. If Dr. Bradley does not devote himself to this task, and no light one it will be, someone else must, in justice to Boker and American literature. Dr. Bradley has handled his materials and opinions with fitting conservatism and made of them a beautiful and readable book. And that review is written by Robert E. Spiller of Swarthmore College. I'm going to finish with one of his love poems. It's a doozy. What can I say? I have been mounted on life's topmost wave until my forehead kissed the dazzling cloud. I've been dashed beneath the murky shroud that yawns between the watery crests. I rave sometimes like cursed Orestes, sometimes lathe my limbs in dews of asphodel, or bowed with torrid heat, I moan to heaven aloud, or shrink with winter in its icy cave. Now peace broods over me. Now savage rage spurns me across the world. Nor am I free from nightly visions when the pictured page of sleep unfolds its very leaves to me, changing as often as the mimic stage, and all this, lady, through my love for thee. In the mid-June edition of Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, that one's called Sweet Tooth. It's going to feature the chocolatier Wilbur and the coconut entrepreneur Baker and the bubblicious gum manufacturer Fleer, possibly more, but at least I want to do those three. And in honor of the Summer Olympics in Paris, the July 2024 episode of All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories will be part 2 of the Olympians. We've already done the 1900 Olympics, the Zany Games, about a year and a half ago. These are people who competed in 1904, 1908, and or 1912. Lawson Robertson, Donald Lippincott, Jervis Burdick, and Ted Meredith, who won 2 gold medals. That will be a fun podcast. Laurel Hill East is located at 3822 Ridge Avenue in the Paradise neighborhood of the East Falls section of Philadelphia. It's an easy walk from the bus stop at Ridge and Allegheny, where SEPTA buses are 1 and 61. Free admission. The tours are not free. I mean, we raise money to keep the cemetery in shape by charging you to go on a tour, but you can go wander around anytime you want to. There are a couple of spaces to park across the street, very limited spaces on the grounds. The few that we had are now occupied by construction workers, but if you're very, very careful, you could pull onto the grounds and you could park somewhere where you know it's safe and where you know you won't be blocking anyone. And please do not hit the monuments. Laurel Hill West is at 225 Belmont Avenue in Bala Kidwood. There's parking at the main entrance and at the bell tower. Public transportation's not that good. You've got to either take the SEPTA Regional Rail to Manayunk or one of the many buses to the Wissahickon Transfer Center on Ridge Avenue. But then you've got to cross the Schuylkill River on the Pencoid Pedestrian Bridge and climb the hill at Writers Ferry Road to the entrance near the Pet Cemetery. If you download the audios I've done for self-guided tours, they will lead you to a 40 to 45 minute tour that talks about people that are interred along the route that you'll be walking in the cemetery if you're walking the bicycle route. Both Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West are currently open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And we welcome visitors. We welcome anyone. We like dog walkers. A lot of cemeteries have the big sign that says, "No dogs allowed." We just ask that you pick up after yourself, you keep your dog on a lead. That's not so tough, is it? Bike riders, skateboarders love Laurel Hill West. Photographers, painters, bird watchers, nature buffs, tree and plant lovers, strollers, both the 2-footed and the 4-wheel variety. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram. You'll get a daily reminder of our inhabitants and activities. You can also follow All Bones Considered on Instagram and Facebook. And then I want you to become a friend of Laurel Hill. A friend of Laurel Hill not only supports our mission, it gives you an opportunity for a lot of members-only specials. You get a discount in the gift shop. We have special members-only tours conducted each year, including some inside the mausoleum tours. We've already done that one this year. These may be cemeteries, but I promise you, these are a couple of the liveliest spots in town. If you want to find the gift shop online, go to the website, laurelhillphl.com, and under Support, find the gift shop. It's in the left-hand column. Our theme song, Names at Peace, was written and performed by local artist James Harrow. All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, and Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, are researched, written, narrated, and produced by me, Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine at Temple University. You can reach me through my email, jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. Remember, keep body and soul together until next time on All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, where the plot thickens. Stick around to hear the references that I use for this podcast, and boy, there are a lot of them. Ooh. Until the next time we meet, stay safe, stay well, stay above ground. Okay, I warn you, this is a long one. For Richard Penn Smith, you can get a copy of Davy Crockett. What's the full name of it? Here it is, Colonel Crockett's Exploits and Adventures in Texas, wherein is contained a full account of his journey from Tennessee to the Red River in Natchitoches and thence across Texas to San Antonio, including his many hairbreadth escapes, together with a topographical, historical, and political view of Texas. Written by himself. Well, it wasn't. It was written by Richard. And you can go to archive.com, I guess. And you can find a copy of that. From the Sewanee Review, April 1918. The author on this is Archibald Henderson. It's called The American Drama, a Survey. Nice background for the history of drama in the United States. 1856, there's another book called The Miscellaneous Works of the Late Richard Penn Smith. That was collected by his son, Horace W. Smith. That's Horace Weems Smith. Published by Horace Weems Smith, number 69 South 7th Street, copyright 1856. Davy Crockett, Real and Legendary. The review is by Ernest E. Licey. This is actually a book review in Southwest Review, July 1934. Volume 19, number 4, pages 3 through 5. Did Davy Crockett Surrender at the Alamo? A Contemporary Letter by Thomas Lawrence Connolly. It's from the Journal of Southern History, August 1860. Pages 368 to 376. And finally, the Life and Writings of Richard Penn Smith, with a reprint of his play The Deformed, 1830, by Bruce Welker McCullough. A thesis presented to the faculty of the graduate school in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, 1917. is the date on that thesis. It's a good one, too. I got most of my information for Robert Montgomery Bird out of another thesis. This is called The Life and Dramatic Works of Robert Montgomery Bird. It was by Clement E. Faust, A.M., Ph.D., instructor in English, University of Pennsylvania, a thesis presented to the faculty of the graduate school in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy. This is from the Knickerbocker Press, New York, 1919. There were several other sources I used, but I did not write them down in my, unfortunately, typical sloppy manner. I try to keep track of all the articles I use, but I'm not always successful, I've got to admit. Now, Robert Taylor Conrad, as you heard, I stepped into something there. I mean, coming up with a guy who was mayor of Philadelphia during the consolidation and a know-nothing meant that I had to do a little studying on some things I didn't know very well. There's an article called The Philadelphia Consolidation of 1854, a Reappraisal by Michael P. McCarthy. That's in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, October 1986, volume 110, number 4, pages 531 to 548. I was fortunate in that I was able to contact an author. I had found his CV online that said he had written about Conrad, but I couldn't find anything else. So fortunately, he's still around. He's teaching. And I emailed him, and he sent me the draft of his book that's called Acts of Manhood. His name is Carl Kippola, Kippola. And it had some information about Conrad that I didn't get anyplace else, so I wanted to acknowledge that. But it's an interesting thesis which was turned into a book about the new man on American stage, the competing masculine models of the rowdy, the dandy, and the honest man, which have been around forever in theater, and especially in the United States. It's a cool book if you're into theater history. Slavery, Nativism, and the Forgotten History of Independence Hall. The authors on that were Charlene Mears and Charlene Myers. That's not a typo. I had to look at that twice. Charlene Mears, M-I-E-R-S, and Charlene Myers, M-I-R-E-S. Wow. It's from Pennsylvania History, a journal of Mid-Atlantic Studies, Autumn 2000, Volume 67, Number 4, pages 481 to 501. Aspects of Moral Reform in Early 19th Century Philadelphia by J. Thomas Jable, J-A-B-L-E. It's from the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, July 1978, Volume 102, Number 3, pages 344 to 363. And from Anti-Catholicism to Church-State Separation. This is from a book called Inventing America's First Immigration Crisis, Political Nativism in the Antebellum West. It is by Luke Ritter. It's from Fordham University Press, 2021. It's a really cool read. It really is. Also on Conrad, there was some good primary stuff in his folder at the cemetery, in the archives. There were a couple of letters from people who were trying to find out who had actually paid for the monument, and they were unable to do so, although there were some suggestions. The Monument Committee was James S. Pringle, president of the Spring Garden Savings Fund, J. Alfred Eisenbray, a merchant who, I don't know his date of birth, but he's buried in the Woodlands, and he died in 1876, and the Reverend Thomas Taylor Conrad, who is buried at Laurel Hill East at S80. He's down by the river. He was born in 1836 and died in 1893. There's a terrific article called From Anti-Catholicism. Actually, it's a chapter out of a book. Joe, you didn't write the name of the book down. This is chapter 6. It's called From Anti-Catholicism to Church-State Separation. And then the little biographical sketch I told you about from Graham's Magazine, June 1844. Volume 25, Number 6. It's just called Our Contributors, Number 12, Robert T. Conrad, with a portrait. It starts on page 241, goes to page 243. The name of the author of the sketch is not printed with the article. It is printed in the index of the magazine, though, and that's how I know it's Edgar A. Poe who wrote that. As far as George Henry Boker, there was a wealth of material. One of the articles that I used was by Joseph Wood Crutch. It's out of the Sewanee Review. But it does not give me the year. That's very odd. This is I downloaded this from JSTOR, and JSTOR usually is very good about giving the source on material. But for some reason, it is not here. I just know it's Sewanee Review, Joseph Wood Crutch, and a long, long article about Boker. Similarly, there's another thing that I downloaded from JSTOR. It's called The Dramas of George Henry Boker. It's chapter 9 of something by Arthur Hobson Quinn. And it is an incredibly thorough look at all of the 9 plays that were produced, who starred in them the first night when they opened, what else happened with the play. It's a very admirable work to nail down all these details. You know, that's where I found out that Mrs. Drew played Francesca when it opened in Philadelphia, when Francesca de Rimini opened in Philadelphia. Then there is A Neglected American, Works, George Henry Boker, Poet and Patriot by Edward Scully Bradley. This is a review of a biography that's written by Robert E. Spiller. This also was in the Sewanee Review, volume 36, number 2, April 1928, pages 243 to 246. Then there's the Union League of Philadelphia and the Civil War, written by Barbara J. Mitnick. Pennsylvania Legacies, volume 13, number 1 through 2, June 2013, pages 28 to 42. And then, yes, there is an official biography. George Henry Boker, Poet and Patriot by Edward Scully Bradley, Assistant Professor of English, University of Pennsylvania Press. Humphrey Milford, London, Oxford University Press. 1927 was the date on this biography by Bradley. I told you there was a lot, and I probably missed a few. I usually do. Anyway, thanks for listening. And come back in a couple of weeks. I'll have another one for you. Not quite as long and complex, I hope.